Hello everyone, friends. Welcome. You watch and listen to Vitaly Portnikov's Arguments channel and the Rashkin Report channel at the same time. My name is Yury Rashkin. I congratulate you for being here with us because Vitaly Portnikov is with us. I am very happy to welcome Vitaly whenever we see Vitaly on the air in principle, but especially when he is on our channel, visiting us. Vitaly, I welcome you. Greetings, hello. Well, we have entered the new year, and it feels like Donald Trump has turned a new one, as it were, on the calendar. Started a new calendar. He finished reconciling everyone in Ukraine and decided to move on to peacekeeping. Now turning my attention to Venezuela. How do you see what happened here? You see that the criminal Maduro has been arrested here, and you have a different view because I, as an American, see here more of a threat to our security than the advantages of this action, without justifying Maduro. But of course, declaring that it will now create a lot of questions in the world. But I see how people in Ukraine rejoice that a criminal has been arrested, that the scoundrels have been arrested, that perhaps Putin now needs to prepare himself, that he may not be the next. Well, I don't know. Tomorrow Lukashenko, the day after tomorrow Putin. Well, I must say right away that the award for the head of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was appointed by the previous administration, the Joseph Biden administration, and the administration of Donald Trump has only increased this award. Reading Maduro is a usurper of power and a criminal. And indeed, the regime that was created in Venezuela by the Gachins, and which was actively supported by Russian security officers and Cuban communists, is one of the most disgusting regimes in the modern world. This is a very obvious fact for me. And the question always arises, how do you want to punish criminals for whose heads you promise a reward, if your law enforcement agencies cannot bring these criminals to the court of the United States? Because it speaks to the level at which we are interested in solving this problem. Not boots on the ground, but a bounty on the head. Well, naturally, because we are talking about a person who was personally accused of specific crimes in the United States. Once again, this is not a Trump story. This is the history of all previous administrations. It's just that under the Biden administration, Maduro once again usurped the election. And thus, as you know, the laws of the president of Venezuela are not recognized by most of the countries of the civilized world. But again, to be honest, I'm not worried about it. The fact that Maduro ended up in an American court. And I'm just interested in the question of what will happen next. Because I believe that the United States should not just capture criminals, but should help people. Crack down on dictatorships. In other words, there should be a full-fledged, as George Bush did, the conduct of troops, real military actions, and the real destruction of the usurping regime with the punishment of those who were its participants. That's how it was in Iraq. As you know, Donald Trump is an opponent of this position. A lot of Americans are against this position. And I think that what was supposed to happen happened in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was overthrown, and the persons who were members of the governing bodies of the Arab Socialist Revival Party were actually the right to participate in the political process. Many of them have been brought to trial for their crimes. By the way, something similar is happening in Syria now, because Basharas did not just flee the country there. The regime of the Arab Socialist Party was actually destroyed there. In Venezuela, we see a completely opposite picture, which, frankly, surprises me. Donald Trump says that he wants to cooperate with the old Venezuelan authorities, that is, with the associates of Hugo Chavez. That he does not recognize the authority of the Venezuelan opposition leader Machado, although she won. The opposition won the presidential election. I don't understand why he says that the oppositionists don't enjoy authority there. In the end, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. It is supported by a large part of Venezuelans. He is now saying that if he does not support her, she will not win any elections. This is a very strange attitude to what is happening. And it interests me much more than the story of Mataram. On the eve of our broadcast, I watched the news from Caracas on Venezuelan channels. But the new old leadership of the National Assembly was elected there, headed by the brother of the current acting president of the country. She holds a meeting under three portraits, one of Simon Bolivar, the other Hugo Chavez, the third Maduro, and his wife Silvia Flores. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello is a much more, I would say, dangerous figure than Maduro, who calls for national unity. You know, Vitaly, this is incredibly interesting, because in fact Marco Rubio stressed that he is satisfied with this option. When you publicly curse the United States, and privately you agree to our terms. And this, it seems to me, is another option for the potential development of events in Ukraine, which could suit this administration. When the portraits are all correct. But what happens if you are able to talk behind closed doors? That's the main question. So that's not how it works. It's just because they don't want a real military operation. Because they understand that hundreds of American soldiers will die during this operation. They are forced to come up with some broken schemes. That is, they believe that these people, for some reason, will give them their oil, which because we'll cut off their oxygen. But they are now selling this oil to China and Russia. As you understand, a large number of these people are in this Venezuelan leadership. It is corrupted by Moscow and Beijing. Yes, I admit that there are some people who can take money from Washington. But, unfortunately, it is impossible to buy them all if someone else has already bought them. That's what I want to say. Then these people, they are very often ideologically blinded, who come out in Venezuela. It's not just drug cartel bandits, as Trump and Rubio want to think. This, in fact, radical communists. This is Madame Rodriguez and her brother. They are generally the children of one of the founders of the Maoist party in Venezuela. It's the Maoists, you know. Literally. And how do the Maoists feel to Trump? Well, you can see how they feel about Trump, right? It's not good. They are just somehow trying to make some peaceful statements there, as she did today. So Maduro was making peace-loving statements. Well, we saw a meeting of the United Nations Security Council today, where the representative of Venezuela spoke quite harshly about the violation of sovereignty and everything else. In other words, we have to assume that Rubio believes that these people will utter all these words. But in fact, what should they really do? Allow American companies to develop Venezuelan oil. That's what Trump wants. First of all, it is necessary to understand how American companies themselves are interested in this. They say only Chevron is now in a position to do something here. Well, and these are huge billions of investments, it is unclear when they will pay off. Because you know that Chavez, in fact, destroyed the Venezuelan oil refining. But again, in order to even double the production of Venezuelan oil in a few years, a lot of money is needed. And all the same, this oil will not play any serious decisive role on the world market. You say that Marco Rubio had the wrong priorities. Listen to Marco Rubio does not look like a person who is thinking about anything except how to make a nice Trump. After all, they did everything nice to Trump. They drive Maduro around New York like, you know, at the triumph of the Roman emperors. But Marco Rubio is interested in being chosen by Trump as an heir, not by J.D. Vance. He's not interested in anything in this life anymore. Well, he created such a beautiful performance. As far as I understand, he is responsible for Latin America because he is ethnic Cuban. Maybe he will create such a spectrum in Cuba. The question there is, will this leadership also remain in Cuba? Is that how it is? Will they steal Raul Castro or Diaz-Canel there, and then the Communist Party of Cuba will continue to lead the country? Or is it not? I don't understand. But they saw it? They'll get scared and run away, and they'll tell Trump whatever you want, just don't kidnap us. Well, that's the idea, isn't it? It is clear that you can kidnap anyone, but it is impossible to kidnap everyone. Do you understand this or not? After all, Maduro is not the dictatorship, the dictator is in charge. Need to kidnap the dictator. But this is not quite true. This is not a dictatorship of the soul, as Putin is not a dictatorship of the soul, as Jinping is not a dictatorship of the soul. Personally, there is this United Socialist Party of Venezuela, created by Chavez. It's an ideology, it's Chavismo, but it's one of the offshoots of communism. Hugo Chavez was the leader of this party, just as Lenin once created this Bolshevik party. He died, lies in the mausoleum. He has, so to speak, an heir. As Lenin had become the heir, Lenin, of course, did not choose him. Stalin. And, by the way, Stalin was a figure, as they say, worse than Lenin. But that the Soviet Union disappeared after Stalin's death, the Communist Party disappeared. Imagine that you stole Stalin in '52. And they didn't do anything else. They stole Stalin, brought him to New York, tried him. It was for that, I think, just like Maduro. Well, the Central Committee of the VKB gathered for a plenum, and, under the portrait of Stalin, elected its general secretary. Relatively speaking, take it or Malenkov. And then what? In other words, the idea is that Berry or Malenkov will be more afraid. And then he will do whatever President Truman or Sinhauer wants. I don't understand, I say again, I see some kind of madness in this. Maybe I don't understand something. Well, it's a bit of a gangster approach, when if you don't comply, then you will wake up and sleep with the fish on the shore, at the bottom of the river. And how many problems can be solved in this way, how much cement is needed? But this is a madhouse. I was just interested to understand and hear your opinion, because this is not the world order that existed after the Second World War. This is a variant of the American policeman, who, however, does not follow the orders of a justice of the peace. But because the policeman decided if we accused you as a criminal, then we can arrest you, wherever you are, whoever you are. It doesn't matter if there is one, no, it doesn't matter where there are boundaries, nothing. You are a criminal, we have decided, we have arrested. I understand, but what will it look like in the political sense of the word? That is it possible to establish control over Venezuela? This is the most important question for me, without introducing an army there. Well, let's imagine. Would it have been possible to offer something to the elite in the Kremlin in 1950 if Stalin had been kidnapped, so that they, well, I do not know, would have abandoned communism? Let's look at this situation, topsy-turvy. You've just remembered the reaction of the Ukrainian. Let's imagine, on February 24, 2022, some objects of the Ukrainian army were bombed. Some Russian special forces broke into Kiev on Bankovaya Street, kidnapped President Zelensky and disappeared. And the President Putin, and said that President Zelensky kidnapped, he is a usurper of power, he came to power in a coup. And we demand that the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada of Stefanchik fulfilled all our terms and conditions. He carried out denazification, demilitarization, and does nothing else at the same time. Just demands from Stefanchik. So what should Stefanchik do? What he says, yes, of course, we will be happy to spend anything here. Just don't touch me, don't kidnap me, please. But it would not have been the same, as you understand. In order to establish control over the country, a regular army should be introduced on the territory of this country. But it doesn't work any other way. And if we take and kidnap Lukashenko now, and why is it necessary to kidnap Lukashenko, who likes Trump? Who will kidnap him? He generally calls him a wise and wonderful ruler. No, but if now the great Trump decides to kidnap our problems, dictator all over the world, well, will Belarus stop being a dictatorship? Is it personalistic? Is it possible there? Or is it just Putin leading troops even faster? There are troops there. But this, of course, is a personalistic mode. But I think that Lukashenko will have someone to replace. Moscow will somehow cope with this situation. And the Belarusian elite. In other words, it's pointless. Listen, Lukashenko has 3 children, right? Here is the eldest son in this. Do you think that if Lukashenko is kidnapped, then the eldest son will not be able to do anything? He'll be scared. Do you know what Nicolas Madura's eldest son does? Nicolas Madura Gera. He is a member of the National Assembly. I watched his big speech. Here he is, a member of the Commission for the Return of this, what's his name? Madura to Venezuela, which was created by President Rodriguez. That is, he has not gone anywhere, as they say. I must say, continues. Work and show your political. Trump is not against public performance. He just says, let's agree quietly. I tell you again, I think this is insanity. But I can't because there is a lot of craziness. If it happens, then any madness that happens in Venezuela can happen. I'm telling you, Dad, you've made us all strong people in the family. We're here fulfilling our obligations until you get back. The motherland is in good hands, Dad, and soon we will embrace. Here in Venezuela, and you'll see your guys, Cilia, and you'll see them, we'll see them. Let Venezuela live, let the motherland live. We are ready to do everything that is needed here. This is from Madura Jr.'s speech in Parliament a few hours ago. I did it for you almost live there. But then, Vitaly, I am very glad that we have a guest of your intellect to help us understand what such insanity in politics will lead to, because it looks like a very dangerous construction. You see, we need to wait and see how it develops. I would still like to understand what will happen next, because up to this time, we have always seen absolutely specific American operations, not only American ones, which were designed to replace, let's say, the authoritarian mode or previously disloyal mode. Americans, by the way, have not always carried out such operations against authoritarian regimes. They very often carried out these operations against regimes that the West did not inspire during the Cold War. They just weren't satisfied. Here is a vivid example of this, for example, their participation in the overthrow of the government of Mossadegh in Iran. Again, these were oil interests. Or the government of Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic. I can strain myself and remember a few more of these American ones. And Western special operations in general against people who were the personification of the democratic choice of their peoples, rather than dictators. But there were also some concrete actions to change dictatorial regimes. I can find an analogy. I'm trying to find her right now, something similar related to what they want to do with Maduro right now. Actually, this analogy is described in detail in one of the most famous novels of the great Peruvian writer Maria Vargas Llosa, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Feast of the Goat. The Americans helped. The collapse of the dictatorship of the Trujillo family in the Dominican Republic. It was a brutal dictatorship, absolutely savage, absolutely illiterate, absolutely crazy. Very similar to the dictatorship of Chavez and Maduro, only not the left, but the right. And quite, I would say, aggressive, because their Trujillo constantly fought with the Goitians, almost staged wars. In general, he had a lot of different, I would say, actions there. But at the same time, the United States helped strengthen the power of a man who, under the dictatorship of Trujillo, held the position of no less than president. Dominican Republic, Joaquin Balaguer. That is, he was the vice president, while Trujillo was alive. And Trujillo liked him very much, because he wrote about his poems there. Oh yes, he was a writer in general, became the Minister of Culture, and then they made him such a cardboard president. But when Trujillo died, as a result of an assassination attempt, Balaguer first put these people who attempted to kill him in prison, and then he released them, and, with the assistance of American forces, the American Navy, expelled family members of the murdered dictator from the Dominican Republic. And he himself became a real authoritarian ruler for the next, as far as I remember, 30, if not 40 years. He last ran for president when he was already 95 years old. And this American administration of that time was quite satisfied. Moreover, I repeat, when Trukis came to power, Juan Bosch, who was a person of the opposite views of the left, but was a progressive man, they have contributed to the Americans his downfall. If I'm not mistaken. That's how it all happened. And the return of Balaguer, who no longer gave power to anyone, at some point lost power to the opposition politician and businessman Guzman, who as a result committed suicide as head of state. This is a scheme that I understand. Maybe they would like Trump and Ruby, but Ruby in general, I think, understands Latin American politics better than me, as he still does. I've been doing this all my life. Maybe they want such a scheme. Well, the dictator has been kidnapped, as it were. And the people who gathered in the Venezuelan leadership, it's simple. They will lead the country, but share profits with American companies. But I do not know how much such a scheme can be done with ultra-left radicals. Do you understand? Balaguer was not a left-wing radical. He was not a right-wing radical either. He was just an authoritarian ruler who was focused primarily on his power, like Trump. And that's why it was possible to negotiate with him, because he did not promise anything like that to people, what the Chavistas promise. They also have social bases. As Trump has a base, so these have bases. These are people who are generally set up, as you know how. Have you heard that President Rodriguez has already said that there is a Zionist trace in the abduction of Madonna? No, but I see here the logic for her to unite with MAGA, because MAGA is against participating in any wars. And if we remind you here that it is always the fault of the Jews, then MAGA will agree here. No, I think it's absolutely not interesting. MAGA, I don't think he even suspects. When she talks about the Zionist trail, this is all that unites left-wing radicals around the world. This is their anti-Zionist ideology. You know that they are anti-Zionist. It's a battle cry that Israel is standing here. Israel stands here, yes, that's why we should all unite as anti-imperialists, because Israel is America's fifth column. Very simple. But again, yes, these are all routine speeches, routine slogans. Now it seems to me that we, on the one hand, will not see the collapse of the regime due to the fact that there is no Maduro. And we will not see, I do not expect that. This logic of the fact that they will agree with us now out of fear will work. I agree with you that this is insanity. But it seems to me that the regime definitely should not fall apart because of Maduro. Maduro is not a carrier of this at all. The wall of this regime, you know. The bearing wall of this regime is the Yugobas mausoleum lying there. I'm thinking, what if Medvedev had been kidnapped? Why Medvedev? Well, as if because he doesn't personify the regime in any way, but, as if, on the one hand, a prominent character, but it's almost a farce. No, wait, Maduro is not a bear. Maduro is Putin. Well, at that moment. But if you kidnapped Putin, does that mean it's over? Well, it's so often discussed. We have been waiting for how many years that it is enough to kill Putin. And now we look at Maduro, and it looks like removing one person doesn't solve anything. Well, of course, it doesn't solve anything. I am constantly reminded when Ukrainians say that if Putin is removed, then everything will end. I say yes, but Putin is not Marshal Zhukov, he is Marshal Berry. Imagine that Putin's heir becomes a military man who generally lives by war. As a result, the generals defeat the Chekists there. What's next? No, again, it is clear that if the generals do not have money for the war, then what is the general, what are the Chekists? It can't do anything further. But if there is money, then the war can continue with even greater ferocity, because it will interest the military as the main means of their self-assertion. Well, that is, there are no guarantees. You see, I think that all these stories in post-Soviet society, by the way, are about the fact that if Putin is removed, everything will continue to happen. Well, they come from the stories of grandparents, you know. Because there is a Soviet memory among people we know alive that after Stalin's death there was a thaw. And after the death of Brezhnev and his several heirs, perestroika began. So we know that if such a long-term leader dies, I would say, changes begin. No, but between Brezhnev and Gorbachev. What was there a couple, there, Chernenko? Well, Andropov was, Chernenko was a couple for several years. No, we're just talking, that was gerontocracy. Here she is all gone to the grave, all. Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, Ustinov, Suslov. And then the changes began. In fact, it was the end of the Brezhnev era. You know that after all these people were members of the Brezhnev Politburo. But I always say that we don't remember another change. Because we didn't live then, and we didn't have relatives who lived then, we didn't see them. It was Lenin's death. Lenin, on the eve of his death, was in fact the engine of change. Because, as a big-thinking person, he saw that the dogmatic economic model could not cope with the real needs of society. From there, the new economic policy. In fact, Lenin in the 20s began everything that Deng Xiaoping later carried out in China. But the heirs of Lenin and Stalin first of all went completely opposite. In the proper way. They followed the path of implementing dogma and created a model that Lenin did not think of, the model of the camp economy. Actually, which could only be implemented by mass repression among the regime's base. Because you understand that, in fact, those people who fell victim to the regime, the main part of them were, first of all, the elite of the regime, and secondly, the base of the regime. At first, aristocrats, nobles, business owners, strong peasants were killed. And so on, and then went to the expense of the base of the regime. But this allowed us to create an economy that existed, in fact, until the mid-50s of our century. If Lenin had not died, perhaps Stalin's camp economy would not have arisen. There would not have been such a nightmare. Everything sounds very personalistic, because it seems to me that under Lenin it was Leninist, under Stalin it was Stalinist. Therefore, if there is no Putin, I am saying that the death of the first person, absolutely, does not necessarily mean changes for the better. This is also true. But it still sounds like personality means almost everything. Well, in an authoritarian regime, it means a lot, because the personality somehow determines the course of the country's development. But we are talking about the collapse of the regime. The regime will not collapse after Lenin's death. But he has changed for the worst. But Maduro is not Lenin, that's the point. Maduro is not a person who asked some ideological narratives. This is the man who was elected Kavasam, precisely because they do not represent any danger. For his idea of his own legacy. Well, and by the way, there has always been a person next to Maduro who guaranteed this preservation of Chavismo. In its, so to speak, pristine form. This is Silvia Flores, Matter's wife. Actually. In this pair, of course, she played the main role. Well, you see how much we learn. Now we're going to have a lot of hearings. Maduro will go through this process, will continue, will be proved, but there is a legal opportunity to try her. Could they prove all his crimes, could he lose in such a trial? It seems to me that those who believe that this will solve all problems quickly at once, it does not take into account that this process will also take time. But in principle, as it seems to me, this is the destruction of the international relations, when organizations, agreements, when in the end. No, well, listen, it doesn't matter at all. Both the United States and other countries have carried out such operations repeatedly. The United States landed in Panama, arrested Manuel Noriega, and ensured the transition to a democratic one. He actually returned power to the Democratic administration, something that Trump does not do to the person who won the presidency. You don't think this administration is capable of doing anything right, do you? Yeah, whatever, but she's doing the same thing. This has happened many times already. President Reagan landed troops on Grenada once there was a military coup against Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, and he was assassinated. But this and that, and another situation required American boots on the ground, and here so far, we have only kidnapped the head of state. Yes, I'm not arguing, but it's very similar to everything that has already happened, and it didn't destroy it. Because it doesn't exist for that. Therefore, when he starts talking about the destruction of the it's funny to me that the abduction of matter for some reason destroyed the That's all that happened before, did not destroy the But this is the world order, right? No, it's wrong, because it happens all the time. We won't see anything new. This is the world order that has always been there. The right of the strong. The right of the strong. But again, the question is always who exercises this right. I say again, when we talk about the sovereignty of states. And that's what sovereignty has been violated. And international law has been violated. In addition to the sovereignty of states, there is another thing, the usurpation of power in a particular country. A group of people who do not have the authority to do so. This is also a violation of all laws and order. The presidential elections were held in Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro lost this election. Is it that he has forcefully imposed his rule on the people of Venezuela? And this is not the first time. Is it possible to consider the people who run Venezuela as legitimate authorities, or is it a group of criminals that should be retried in court? Yes, the Venezuelan people do not have the opportunity to take them to court. But perhaps if there is a large democratic state with an army and special services, perhaps these people can be arrested. Or eliminate the usurpers. This may also be the idea. I think the question, again, is not whether they are terrible. The question is how we solve this problem. Well, as it is possible, so decide. Then just pushing this theory further, I'm trying to figure out how this can be a workable construct. Because Trump says that we don't need the last thing he said, that's why it's so important to conduct live broadcasts. He said that we would not need to attack Cuba because Venezuela supported Cuba. And if we cut off the oxygen to Venezuela, then we are already controlling Cuba in this way too. Therefore, there is a logic. Because if Venezuelan oil does not flow to Cuba, it is completely unclear how the Cuban regime will exist. But this is in the event that she does not go there. Because the Cuban regime is absolutely parasitic. This is a regime that has destroyed the Cuban state, the Cuban economy, and Cuban society. More scoundrels than the Castro brothers, I would say, even the communist world has not yet seen. But they lived first on Soviet money, then on Chinese money, now on Venezuelan money. When the lid was supposed to come to them at all, and they began to carry out some economic reforms, then Yugachins appeared, which simply began to supply them with oil. In general, you see, after all these left populist regimes in Latin America mainly existed at the expense of cheap Venezuelan oil. And this suited Russia perfectly. There was also a scheme. Russia helps Venezuela, and Venezuela supplies oil to Cuba. Now the question is, what will be the model of Cuba's economic existence? If this regime stops delivering something to Cuba, and if it doesn't stop. Well, look, these are very important precedents, because when we say that it is possible to arrest the head of the regime, and the regime will not fall apart, this is very important. Then we say, is it possible then to cut off the economic means of existence of the dictatorship? And then the dictatorship will cease to exist. Well, of course, in the end, she will stop, and this is for her. Does it make sense to have sanctions against Russia, against Iran? This is what Barack Obama said cumulatively. In other words, then do you think that this savior can change the regime in Russia? Over time, of course. Of course, if effective sanctions are imposed and promoted. and to do everything possible so that the countries of the global south do not help Russia, then sooner or later, Russia will fall into the economic abyss, and the regime will collapse. I just don't know when it's going to happen. Do you understand what the problem is? In general, I think, if we talk about Russia, that the Russian economy is already in a state of death. And therefore, from the point of view of formal logic, Putin would now have to agree with Trump on the wonderful conditions that Trump offers him. Only Putin, and it has always been, and remains the same now, does not care about the Russian economy. He just doesn't want to see it. In other words, this means that for certain dictatorial regimes, and we don't know, Cuba is probably more prudent than Putin. If you put pressure on their wallet, they come to their senses. But Putin is more prudent than Putin. In general, I believe that they absolutely live in their own world. All this is the leadership of the Communist Party Cube. Then why should they give up? They'll just be like, you'll eat less, Dad will keep drinking. The regime may simply collapse. There are times when everything collapses, like in Haiti. When there is not enough money for bayonets. When there is not enough money for anything. Such a moment can happen. You understand that these people, they very often question whether they give up or not. The question is what they don't really see. You know what? I had one of the most vivid impressions in my life when, well, it was the period of perestroika. I came to the press center of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union in Moscow for the first press conference of the Secretary General, the Central Committee of the Socialist United Party of Germany, and the representative of the State Council of the Georgian. Who was the heir, who seems to have broken the wall, as if destroyed the wall, isn't it true? Who was the heir of Emilie Hafenmacher? Comrade Egon Krenz tells us, the Berlin Wall, says Egon Krenz, will stand forever, because it is one of the main stabilizing factors of peace and security on the European continent. This is Comrade Egon Krenz speaking, and I'm sitting next to the Western one. German journalists. They just laugh out loud. But the wall is standing, it's all true. He says all this in a confident voice. You see, he is the former head of the Komsomol, he is so imposing all over himself. And so he says it all. And 3 or 4 days after his departure from Moscow, the wall. Something like that was a very short period. I remember this because here I was sitting, I saw a man with burning eyes, a confident, delivered voice. You know, in German corresponds to, you know, supports this belief, I would say, the correct formulation of the question. It's all being said in German now, you know. Yes, it will stand. And you almost believe it. And then she bangs and falls. And then the question arises, what was he thinking at that moment? He thinks he was sure she wasn't going anywhere. There even then. The evening when a member of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the EP and the first secretary of the Berlin District Party, Gunther Schabowski, spoke on East German television with a statement that trips of residents of the GDR of Germany are now possible. It didn't even occur to them at that moment that the wall was hands. It collapsed not because they made such a decision, but because the secretary of the Berlin Regional Party Committee, the Regional Party, simply made an ill-considered statement. And people decided that they could move now, and went there, to this one. West Berlin. And the East German border guards did not understand what to do, because they also heard this speech by Schabowski. And so it collapsed. It happens. Therefore, I say again, there is no need to overestimate the understanding of everyone. All these people, in general, people who live in closed hermetic systems, and any authoritarian system is a closed hermetic system. What will happen to them tomorrow? The problem is that American politics is turning into a closed hermetic system. That's what's dangerous, that Trump also lives in some kind of strange world. It really is. But the problem is that, at least in the United States, we see that it swings on more than he gets. And so the question is, does he swing more than he gets? Maybe he's committed to the show after all. He has a certain picture of the world. What did he get? He can calm down. Imagine that in a week nothing will happen to Venezuela. Yes, well, it won't happen. But then everyone will forget about the Epstein case. No. The Epstein case will not be forgotten, even if Venezuela changes power. The Venezuelan opposition will come to power. Then, well, let's clarify that if this is insanity as a policy, then is it right or wrong to arrest Maduro and bring him to justice in New York? Or they are somehow connected, these 2 points. Maduro should be arrested and brought in to be tried in New York, but at the same time, it is very important to ensure a democratic transition in Venezuela. These should be interrelated things. And Trump is not going to ensure a democratic transition. That's the problem. That is, he takes the first step and does not want to take any steps after that. Maybe. No, he just doesn't want any democratic transition to Venezuela. I am interested in the democratic transition in Venezuela because I am interested in the Venezuelan people. And Trump is interested, apparently, in Venezuelan oil. That's our difference. This helps you to look at Trump's policy in a different way from the point of view of Ukrainian diplomacy. From the point of view of Ukrainian diplomacy, this is a completely different story because he treats Ukrainian diplomacy and the Ukrainian issue in exactly the same way. He keeps saying Putin just has to stop the war because I couldn't conquer Ukraine in 4 years. But if I could, so there would be no conversation. There wouldn't have been a conversation, that's right. In other words, he approaches these things the same way all the time. He has no values, he is a politician without values, that's the problem. What will it lead to? First of all, it's all chaos. Secondly, it is the degradation of world politics. And it's not related to Maduro, it's related to Trump's approaches. I say it again. We are too fixated on the Maduro story. And you need to fixate on history. It's just a precedent. Yes. The precedent is not that he was abducted, but the precedent is that nothing happens after that. The precedent is that the President of the United States does not require the Venezuelan leadership to ensure democratic elections. And Rubio says why there is an election, it is unclear. That's what's weird. And at the same time, the United States does not recognize Maduro as the President of Venezuela. Then who are they talking to? This same Rodriguez has the same legitimacy as Maduro. But perhaps this will lead to an increase in patriotism in the country. Countries that Trump is touching in this way, then. Yes, it will not lead to any doubt. So what? Some consequences, something will come out of it. But again, it's unclear what. You see, everything is very contradictory here. Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia predictably condemned Trump's actions. But neither Brazil, Mexico, nor Colombia recognized the results of the 2024 presidential election in Venezuela. Another crime. It's kind of bad, and the other is bad. Yes, but who is Maduro for them then? A Venezuelan citizen who is simply abducted from his bedroom, or a usurper? It's all very strange here, you know. There's one contradiction on top of another. It looks more or less solid. I think that even the abduction of a usurper from his bedroom looks like a violation of international norms and destroys the world order. I'm not sure. I'm not at all sure. If the abduction of the usurper is accompanied by democratic elections, the law will come to power. If there is a full president of the country, then there is nothing in this that destroys the world order. You know, that's what the people who led to our American invasion of Iraq thought. They thought they had built a democracy there. Yes, that this was the right invasion. I have said many times that I continue to support the American invasion. Because after the invasion of Iraq, there has been a system that is many times safer for the people who live there than the regime of Saddam Hussein. Let me remind you once again, Saddam Hussein's regime attacked Shiite villages. Only the establishment of a no-fly zone over Iraq, on part of the territory of Iraq, over the Shiite and Kurdish parts, made it possible to somehow save these people. And Iraq has a multi-party democracy, federation, de facto self-government of the Kurds, restoration of the rights of the Shiite. Do you understand that none of this happened under Saddam Hussein? You are doomed to these people, if it were not for the invasion of George W. Bush, just a slow death. Due to ethnic origin and religious beliefs. Therefore, I believe that the results of the American invasion of Iraq are very positive. The results of the American invasion of Afghanistan are not positive. Because the Americans left there, actually agreeing with the tyranny that is there. In other words, you preferred to see a real American empire, and not some fictional one, either Trump or just economic. But if there are American troops everywhere, then there. I believe that American troops should promote democracy, transition, and the ability of democratic governments to defend themselves. Well, here is an example of South Korea, which... Well, in South Korea, Americans do not participate in management. No, there is the American military there, it seems to be there. Democracy. Yes, there is relative democracy there, yes. But the US military is simply protecting this democracy from a possible attack from the north. And that's it. But this is not an empire at all. As you understand, South Korea conducts a completely independent foreign policy. In other words, it's not a question of empire, it's a question of global influence, if you like. It can be different. Here Russia exercises global influence, supporting, say, together with China, regimes in Central Asia that do not allow their countries to develop normally. And they use their own population as guest workers in the Russian labor market. What's good about that? Nothing. Or maybe there is an influence that just allows you to build normal democratic societies. It's very difficult in Iraq. I'm not saying anything. But nevertheless, the very appearance of the phenomenon of Iraqi Kurdistan, for example, as a result of the American invasion, is the first of a millennium. An opportunity for the Kurds to create their own autonomy, which is developing. In general, the Kurdish state identity, in terms of the coexistence of Kurds with Arabs in Iraq. This is a great step forward. I believe that George Bush will go down in world history with this. But for some reason, Americans don't think so. Well, Americans don't think a lot of things. The Americans were against the Vietnam War, and as a result, left the people of South Vietnam to fend for themselves. And as a result, millions of people who lived in Saigon, present-day Hachiman, were expelled. Killed in their own city, resettled in the countryside, marginalized. I'm not talking about the crimes that are being committed, but it's, you just want America to be the world's policeman. Of course, because without a world policeman, there will be other world policemen of Russia in the world. And we have a policeman now, but only he has senility. Yes, here is such a situation, here is such a policeman, yes, a little so to speak, Oniskin and Phantomas. It happens. But you just start giving me an example of the opinion of American society, as something that I should perceive. As a kind of ultimate truth. I believe that very often the mood of Americans is just talking about their political infantilism and lack of understanding of the consequences of their actions. America is an example of such public stupidity, which can be written about. Very often. Should we evaluate Zelensky's work based on the opinions of Ukrainians or Americans? We must evaluate Zelensky's work according to the result that this work will lead to as a result. So far, we do not know this result yet. I just see that it seems to me that Ukrainians have a lot more questions for Zelensky than Americans. All people who live in any country, who are busy with their internal affairs, have more questions for their presidents than foreigners, who follow the foreign policy component. As you remember, Gorbachev lost almost all of his authority in the Soviet Union, while for Germany he was a political idol. So what? That is, the story is developing, but the only problem is that Trump is not doing until the end of what should be done, that is, to change the government, to establish democracy in Venezuela, but he does not want to. And he is afraid to decide on it because it will cost money. The treasury is death, it's life, it's blood. He doesn't want to pay this high price. I think it's not about money, it's also about human lives. He promised his base that the Americans would never fight. I assure you that if he wasn't sure that this operation would go off without a grave, he wouldn't have decided on it either. When he talks about people on Earth, he expects it to be a bloodless operation anyway. It's impossible, you know. It is impossible not to sacrifice something and get a result. Therefore, if Trump really starts sending American troops to some countries with the aim of not even establishing democracy, protecting American interests, it will be a completely different story. And the people who voted for him both times, I would say they will never vote for a supporter for Republican representatives again. Never. Because Trump's main idea was that he did not involve America in any new war. And now he has the idea that he has finished all the wars that America has waged. He will even finish helping the wars. And now suddenly he will start new wars, he will fight in Venezuela, he will fight somewhere else. I don't believe it. In other words, this means that the regime needs to withstand some period of pressure. It will pass. Well, it's unknown, it will pass. We don't know what economic actions will be. Maybe will continue the blockade. There may be some shelling of the territory. But, probably, yes. But listen, well, if the regime in Iran, yes, but he survived the bombing and resist. Now he has much bigger problems in connection with what is happening with popular performances. You see, the regime can be destroyed either by military intervention, with the participation of foreign troops, or by its own people. There is no other way. It does not destroy anything by rocket attacks. Is there any lesson for Putin here? There is one lesson for Putin here. It is completely incomprehensible why be an ally of Putin, if all the same, as a result, he must either flee to Moscow or end up in a New York court. This is already Putin's second big ally, which is actually failing, and Putin cannot do anything to protect it from the Americans or from his own people. You may have heard the pre-construction that the secret arrangement between Russia and Putin-Trump, that Trump gives Russia Ukraine, and Russia gives the United States Venezuela. Trump cannot give Ukraine to Russia, and Russia cannot give Venezuela to the United States. The reason is that she could do little in Venezuela that would prevent the United States from carrying out its operation against Mont. That is, it's just not reasonable, it doesn't make sense. We need to discuss another madness. Well, I'm glad then that we just destroyed such an interesting version of reality in just a few words. Well, there is no such variant of reality. Because from what Trump says to Putin, take it. Putin won't take Ukraine, you know. I think so too. He's actually been trying to do this for a year now. By and large, he has been trying to make life easier for Putin in this sense for a year. But nothing happens. Well, when Trump is telling the truth, America is not right now. Pays Ukraine money and provides free weapons. How can Trump give away to Dono that he has no real influence already, except for intelligence information and the sale of weapons for European money? Well, excuse me, that's not what can you offer as a product. And what can Putin offer as a commodity when it comes to Venezuela? Also nothing. Therefore, this is generally a conversation, you know, a cold smoke dispute. Here, friends, I am very glad. Vitaly, thank you so much for joining us, as always. Subscribe to all of Vitaly Portnikov's channels if you haven't subscribed yet, because 1 million people have already subscribed. And you haven't signed up yet. I am sure that all of our viewers and listeners have already subscribed. So, well, at the same time subscribe to Rashkin's Report then, please. Since you are in such a mood to subscribe, click likes. Vitaly, thank you as always. See you again. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes of good luck.